In the Nevada Territory of 1869, a grieving blacksmith who mends broken iron meets a traveling woman doctor who heals broken bodies, but when she claims she can mend broken hearts too, he challenges her with his own shattered soul. Will two outcasts fighting society's expectations discover that some things can only be healed when two broken pieces forge together as one? The hammer struck hot metal with a sound like thunder, sending sparks flying through the dusty air of the blacksmith shop. Ezra Blackwood wiped sweat from his face as the sun came up over Silver Creek, Nevada Territory, in the year 1869. His strong hands, marked with old burns and cuts, shaped a horseshoe on the big iron block called an anvil. The fire in his forge burned bright orange, making everything in the shop glow like sunset. Tools hung on wooden pegs along the walls. Broken wagon wheels and bent horseshoes sat in piles, waiting to be fixed. But there was one corner of the shop that stayed empty and cold, no matter how hot the fire burned. That's where Martha used to sit. 6 months ago, his wife had died from a terrible fever. She used to mend clothes in that corner while he worked, humming soft songs and making him smile. Now when he looked over there, he saw nothing but shadows and dust. His heart felt as cold as winter iron. Ezra was 34 years old and big like a bear. His brown hair was getting gray at the edges, and his face was rough from years of working in the heat. People said he was the best blacksmith in all of Nevada Territory. He could fix anything made of metal. Anything except the hole in his chest where his heart used to be. The sound of horse hooves on dirt made him look up from his work. Through the open doors of his shop, he saw a woman walking toward him. She led a horse that was limping badly, holding tight to old leather reins. Her dress was dirty from travel, and her dark hair was messy under a faded hat. But her green eyes looked strong and determined, like someone who never gave up. "Good morning, sir," she said when she reached his shop. Her voice had a different sound to it, like she came from far away. "My horse lost a shoe about 3 miles back on the road. The man at the general store said, 'You're the best blacksmith around these parts.'" Ezra set down his heavy hammer and walked over to look at her horse. The mare was brown with white spots, and she held up one back foot like it hurt. He knelt down in the dirt and lifted the sore hoof, being gentle even though his hands were big and rough. "What people say and what's really true don't always match up, ma'am," he said, looking at the horse's foot. "But I can help your animal, that's for sure." He could see the problem right away. Not only was the horseshoe missing, but there was a sharp stone stuck deep in the soft part of the hoof. "She's got more wrong than just a missing shoe. There's a stone bruise here too. Gonna need some time to heal up right." The woman's face changed, looking worried. "How much time?" Ezra stood up and brushed dirt off his leather work clothes. The woman seemed in a big hurry to get somewhere. "Few days at least. Maybe a whole week, if you want her ready for hard riding." He studied the woman's face. "I'm Ezra Blackwood, by the way. Ruth Calloway," she said, reaching out her hand like men do when they meet. Most women didn't shake hands, but this one was different. "I'm a doctor, a traveling doctor. There's been word of a sickness called cholera in Carson City. People are dying, and they need help fast." Ezra felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. A doctor. During Martha's last days, when the fever was burning her up, he had begged for a doctor to come. But the nearest one was 50 miles away in Reno, and by the time someone could have fetched him, it would have been too late anyway. "I'm afraid Carson City's gonna have to wait a spell longer, Miss Calloway," he said, his voice rough. "Your horse needs healing, and if you push her now, she'll be lame for the rest of her life. Can't help sick people if you can't get there." Ruth's shoulders dropped like she was carrying a heavy load, but she nodded her head. "Then I guess I need a place to stay for the week. The boarding house I passed looked not very clean." "Mrs. Henderson runs that place," Ezra found himself saying. "She keeps it cleaner than it looks, and her beds won't give you fleas. Her cooking won't poison you either." He stopped for a moment, thinking about Martha again. "I lost my wife to fever not 6 months past. Might have been different if there'd been a doctor close by." Something changed in Ruth's green eyes. They got softer, sadder. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Blackwood. Losing someone you love is the hardest thing in the world." Ezra looked at this strange woman doctor, who shook hands like a man and traveled alone through dangerous country. Most women would have been scared or helpless in her situation. But Ruth Calloway looked like she could handle whatever the world threw at her. "Tell you what," he said. I'll start working on new shoes for your mare right now. And I'll check that stone bruise every day to make sure it's healing proper. Won't charge you extra for the waiting time. That's very kind of you, Ruth said. But I insist on paying fair wages for good work. As she led her limping horse toward the small stable behind his shop, Ezra watched her go. There was something about the way she moved, like she knew exactly where she was going even when the path was unclear. It reminded him of Martha in some ways, but Martha had been soft and gentle. This woman was like good steel, strong and flexible, able to bend without breaking. The rest of the morning, Ezra worked on making new horseshoes while Ruth settled her horse in the stable. She came back into his shop carrying a black leather bag that looked well used and important. Mind if I sit up in that corner? She asked, pointing to Martha's old spot. I noticed some of the men around town have cuts and burns that could use attention. Seems like blacksmith work is dangerous business. Ezra's first thought was to say no. That corner belonged to Martha's memory. But then he looked at Ruth's kind face and thought about all the times he'd burned himself or cut his hands and just wrapped them in old cloth. A real doctor's care would be better. Corner's empty anyway, he said. You can use it if you want. Ruth smiled. And for the first time since Martha died, Ezra's shop didn't feel quite so lonely. Within an hour, word had spread through Silver Creek that there was a lady doctor at the blacksmith shop. Old Pete came by first, holding his hand close to his chest. He'd cut his finger bad while whittling, and it was getting infected and swollen. Don't know about lady doctors, Pete grumbled as Ruth cleaned his wound. Seems unnatural, if you ask me. Good thing nobody asked you then, Ezra said from his forge, where he was heating metal for Ruth's horseshoes. Miss Calloway knows more about healing than any of us know about anything. Ruth worked on Pete's finger with gentle, sure hands. She cleaned the infection, put medicine on it, and wrapped it in clean, white cloth. The whole time, she explained what she was doing and why. Keep this dry for 3 days, she told Pete. Come back if it starts hurting worse, or if you see red lines going up your arm. That would mean the infection is spreading. How much do I owe you? Pete asked, reaching for his small leather coin bag. Nothing, Ruth said. Just promise to keep it clean. Pete looked surprised. Nothing? But you're a real doctor, ain't you? Being a real doctor means helping people who need help, Ruth replied. Not everyone who needs help has money to pay. After Pete left, shaking his head but looking grateful, Ezra stopped his work and looked at Ruth. You don't charge folks for doctoring? Some folks can pay, some can't, Ruth said, cleaning her medical tools with the same care Ezra used on his hammers and tongs. I'd rather help someone who needs it than get rich off other people's pain. More people came throughout the day. Young Billy Thompson hobbled in with a twisted ankle from falling off his horse. Mrs. Garcia brought her baby, who had a bad cough that worried her. Each time, Ruth worked with calm skill, and each time, she asked for no money from people who clearly had little to spare. As the sun got lower in the sky, Ezra found himself stealing glances at Ruth while she worked. She hummed softly, just like Martha used to do. But where Martha's songs had been gentle lullabies, Ruth's humming sounded like hymns, strong and hopeful, like someone who had seen terrible things but still believed good could win. Where'd you learn to be a doctor? He asked during a quiet moment. Ruth looked up from organizing her medical supplies. San Francisco first. Found a doctor there who believed women could learn medicine just as well as men. Then I went to Chicago during the war between the states. Learned surgery in army hospitals, where they needed every pair of hands they could get. Must have been hard seeing all that suffering. It was, Ruth agreed. But it taught me that healing isn't just about fancy schools or expensive medicines. It's about caring enough to try, even when things look hopeless. Ezra thought about that as he shaped the last horseshoe for Ruth's mare. Caring enough to try, even when things looked hopeless. He'd given up trying after Martha died. Just went through the motions of living, fixing other people's broken things while his own heart stayed shattered. As Ruth packed up her medical bag for the day, she looked over at him. Thank you for letting me use your shop, Mr. Blackwood. And thank you for standing up for me with Pete. Not many men would do that. Not many women would travel alone through dangerous country to help sick strangers, Ezra replied. Seems like we both do things that ain't exactly normal. Ruth laughed, and the sound filled the empty spaces in the shop like music. I suppose that's true. Maybe that's why we understand each other. As she walked toward the boarding house in the fading light, Ezra realized something had changed in his shop. For the first time in 6 months, Martha's corner didn't feel cold and empty. It felt warm and alive, filled with purpose again. But Ruth Calloway was just passing through Silver Creek. In a week, maybe less, she'd be gone to help people in Carson City and beyond. Ezra told himself not to get used to having someone around. Getting attached to people only led to more heartbreak when they left. Still, as he banked the coals in his forge for the night, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow morning. For the first time since Martha died, he had a reason to besides just going through the motions of staying alive. The rooster's crow split the morning air like an axe through wood, but Ezra was already awake. He'd been lying in bed thinking about green eyes and gentle hands, wondering why a woman doctor would choose such a hard, lonely life. He dressed quickly and walked to his shop, expecting to find it empty and quiet like always. Instead, he found Ruth already there, kneeling beside a man who was groaning and holding his arm. "What happened?" Ezra asked, hurrying over. "Jake Morrison fell off his roof trying to fix loose boards," Ruth explained without looking up. Her hands moved carefully along the injured man's arm, feeling for broken bones. "I think his arm is broken in 2 places." Jake was a carpenter who lived on the edge of town with his wife and 3 small children. He was young, maybe 25, with blonde hair and usually a big smile. Right now, his face was white with pain, and sweat dripped down his cheeks. "Can't be broken," Jake gasped. "I got work to finish. My family needs the money from that roof job." "Your family needs you healthy more than they need you working with a broken arm," Ruth said firmly. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm going to need some straight pieces of wood for splints, and something to tie them with." Ezra found some thin boards and strips of leather. He watched Ruth work, amazed at how sure and steady her hands were. She lined up Jake's broken bones, then tied the splints tight to keep everything in place. "This will hurt for a few weeks," she told Jake. "But if you keep it still and let it heal right, you'll be able to use it good as new. If you try to work too soon, you might never be able to use that arm properly again." "But the Hendersons are expecting their roof done by next week," Jake protested. "If I don't finish, they'll find someone else, and word will get around that I don't keep my promises." Ezra looked at the young man's worried face and made a decision that surprised even himself. "I'll help you finish the Henderson roof," he said. "I know enough about carpentry to do what needs doing. We'll tell folks you're supervising the work while your arm heals." Both Ruth and Jake stared at him. Ruth looked pleased but surprised. Jake looked like he might cry from relief. "You'd do that for me?" Jake asked. "But you barely know me." "No, you're a good man trying to take care of his family," Ezra replied. "That's enough." After they helped Jake home and explained everything to his worried wife, Ruth and Ezra walked back toward the shop. The morning sun was getting stronger, promising another hot day. "That was a kind thing you did," Ruth said, offering to help with his work. Ezra shrugged, feeling uncomfortable with praise. "Man's got little ones to feed. Besides, I used to help my pa with carpentry before he died. Still remember most of it." "You lost your father young?" 12 years old, Ezra said. "Had to learn blacksmithing fast or starve. Old Jeremiah Miller took me on as his helper, taught me everything I know about metalwork." They walked in comfortable silence for a while. Then Ruth asked, "What was your father like?" No one had asked Ezra about his father in years. Most people in Silver Creek knew he was an orphan, but they never asked for details. He was a good man, worked hard, laughed loud, always had time to help neighbors when they needed it. Kind of like Jake, I guess. "Is that why you offered to help? Because Jake reminds you of your father?" Ezra thought about that. Maybe. Or maybe because you reminded me that some things are more important than just taking care of yourself. They reached the shop, and Ruth began setting up her medical corner again. More people would probably come today. Word was spreading fast that there was a real doctor in town who didn't charge poor folks for treatment. "Ruth?" Ezra said, then stopped. He'd been thinking about something all morning, but wasn't sure how to ask. "What is it? Why do you travel alone? It's dangerous country out here, especially for a woman. Why not settle down in one place and build a regular practice?" Ruth's hands stilled on her medical bag. For a moment, she looked sad and far away. "I tried that once. Had a practice in a small town in California, but the other doctors there didn't like having a woman around. They made it clear I wasn't welcome. Told people I wasn't a real doctor. Just a woman playing at medicine. What happened? One night, someone threw rocks through my office windows. Left a note saying women doctors weren't wanted in their town. Ruth's voice got quiet. I could have stayed and fought them, but I realized there were other places where people needed help and didn't care if their doctor wore a dress or pants. Ezra felt anger rise in his chest like heat from his forge. Those men were fools. Anyone can see you know what you're doing. Thank you, Ruth said softly, but it taught me something important. I don't need anyone's permission to help people. I just need to find the people who need help. The shop door opened, and Mrs. Patterson came in carrying her youngest son. The little boy, maybe 4 years old, was crying and holding his hand against his chest. Dr. Ruth, Mrs. Patterson called out. Tommy burned his hand on the stove. I put it in cold water like my mama always said, but it still hurts him something fierce. Ruth was moving before Mrs. Patterson finished talking. She gently took Tommy's small hand and looked at the red, blistered skin on his palm. You did exactly right with the cold water, she told Mrs. Patterson. That probably kept it from being much worse. She looked at Tommy, who was trying to be brave, but tears still ran down his cheeks. Tommy, can you tell me what happened? I was trying to help Mama cook, Tommy sniffled, but I touched the hot stove by accident. That was very grown-up of you, wanting to help your mama, Ruth said seriously. Now I'm going to put some special medicine on your hand that will make it feel better. It might sting a little bit at first, but then it will start feeling much better. Can you be brave for me? Tommy nodded, wiping his nose with his good hand. Ruth cleaned the burn carefully, then spread a thick salve on it. She wrapped Tommy's hand in soft cloth, making sure it wasn't too tight. Keep this dry and clean, she told Mrs. Patterson. Change the bandage every 2 days and put more of this salve on each time. She handed Mrs. Patterson a small jar. If it starts looking worse instead of better, or if Tommy gets a fever, bring him back right away. How much do I owe you? Mrs. Patterson asked, reaching into her small purse. Nothing today, Ruth said. Just take good care of that little helper of yours. Mrs. Patterson looked like she might argue, but then she smiled gratefully. You're an angel, Dr. Ruth. Thank you. After they left, Ezra looked at Ruth with new understanding. You really don't care about making money, do you? Money's useful, Ruth replied, but it's not why I became a doctor. I became a doctor because people need healing, and I have the skills to help them, even when they don't appreciate it, even when they think you shouldn't be doing it because you're a woman. Ruth was quiet for a moment, cleaning her hands in a basin of water. My father was a preacher back in Ohio, she said finally. He used to tell me that doing the right thing isn't about getting thanks or rewards. It's about looking at yourself in the mirror and knowing you used your gifts to help instead of hurt. Ezra thought about that while he worked on Ruth's horseshoes. The mare was healing well. The stone bruise was getting smaller, and the swelling was going down. In a few more days, she'd be ready for travel again. The thought made his chest feel tight. Around midday, Dr. Henderson from Carson City rode into town. Ezra knew him by reputation, an older man who'd been practicing medicine for 30 years and didn't think much of new ideas or women doctors. Henderson marched into the blacksmith shop like he owned it, his face red with anger. Where is she? He demanded. Where's this woman who's been pretending to be a doctor? Ruth stood up from where she'd been treating a rancher's infected cut. I'm Dr. Ruth Calloway. How can I help you? Help me? Henderson laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. You can help me by stopping this nonsense immediately. I've heard you've been treating patients without proper licensing, without supervision. It's dangerous and illegal. I have proper medical training, Ruth said calmly. I studied in San Francisco and worked in Army hospitals during the war. Army field medicine is not the same as real medical practice, Henderson snapped. And whatever training you think you have, you're still just a woman. Medicine is men's work. Always has been. Ezra stepped forward, his jaw tight with anger. Dr. Henderson, I've seen this woman work. She knows more about healing than most men know about anything. Stay out of this, Blacksmith, Henderson said dismissively. This is medical business. It becomes my business when someone comes into my shop and insults a guest, Ezra replied, his voice low and dangerous. Ruth put a gentle hand on Ezra's arm. It's all right, she said. Then she looked directly at Dr. Henderson. Sir, I understand your concerns, but I've helped people who needed help. I've set broken bones, treated infections, and delivered babies. My patients are healing. Can you say the same about all of yours?" Henderson's face got redder. "How dare you question my abilities? I'll have you arrested for practicing medicine without a license." "Then you'd better arrest half the women in Nevada territory," Ruth replied. "Every midwife, every mother who tends sick children, every wife who sets her husband's broken finger. If caring for people and having medical knowledge is a crime, then most women are criminals." The argument might have continued, but young Billy Thompson came running into the shop, his face white with panic. "Dr. Ruth," he gasped, "come quick. There's been an accident at the mine. 3 men are trapped and at least 2 are hurt bad." Ruth was already grabbing her medical bag. "How far to the mine?" 2 miles up the canyon road," Billy panted. "My pa sent me to fetch you. He said forget about getting the doctor from Carson City. It would take too long." Ruth looked at Dr. Henderson. "Are you coming?" Henderson hesitated, clearly torn between his dislike of Ruth and his duty as a doctor. This is highly irregular. People are dying," Ruth said simply. She looked at Ezra. "Can you drive me there in your wagon? It'll be faster than riding." "Already hitching the horses," Ezra replied. As they rushed out of the shop, Dr. Henderson called after them, "This isn't over. I'll report this to the territorial authorities." But Ruth was already climbing into Ezra's wagon, her medical bag clutched tightly in her hands. As they raced up the dusty canyon road toward the mine, Ezra realized something important was about to happen. This would be Ruth's real test, not treating cuts and burns in the safety of his shop, but dealing with serious injuries under dangerous conditions. And whatever happened at that mine would determine whether Ruth Calloway could stay in Silver Creek, or whether the forces against her would drive her away like they had before. Blood covered the rocks like spilled paint, and the screaming from inside the collapsed mine tunnel made Ezra's skin crawl. Ruth jumped down from his wagon before it even stopped moving, her black medical bag already open in her hands. 20 men stood around the mine entrance, their faces dirty and scared, looking at the pile of broken timber and stone that had trapped their friends inside. "What happened?" Ruth demanded, pushing through the crowd of miners. Tom Bradley, the mine foreman, wiped sweat and dirt from his face. "Support beam cracked about an hour ago. Whole section came down. We got 1 man out already. He's over there." He pointed to where a miner sat against a rock, holding his bloody arm. "But there's still 2 more trapped inside. We can hear them calling for help, but every time we try to dig them out, more rocks fall down." Ruth knelt beside the injured man who'd already been pulled free. His name was Carlos, and he worked in the mine every day to send money back to his family in Mexico. His left arm was bent at a wrong angle, clearly broken, and a deep cut on his forehead bled down into his eyes. "Carlos, can you hear me?" Ruth asked gently, checking his eyes for signs of serious head injury. Yes, I can hear," Carlos whispered. "But my arm, I think it's very bad." "We're going to fix that arm," Ruth said firmly. She looked up at Tom Bradley. "I need clean water, lots of it, and find me some straight pieces of wood for splints." While the miners hurried to get what she needed, Ruth worked on Carlos. Ezra watched her calm, steady movements and felt amazed all over again. Here was chaos and danger all around, but Ruth stayed focused on healing the person right in front of her. From inside the collapsed tunnel came another cry for help, weaker this time. "We have to get them out soon," Tom Bradley said, his voice tight with worry. "But every time we move the wrong rock, the whole thing could come down worse." "What about digging from the side?" suggested Mike Murphy, an older miner with gray hair. "Maybe we could get around the worst of the collapse." "Take too long," Bradley replied. "And we don't know if they're hurt bad enough that waiting might kill them." Ruth finished wrapping Carlos's broken arm and looked up at the mine entrance. "How big is the space where they're trapped?" "Not very big," Bradley answered. "Maybe 6 feet across, 8 feet deep. Just big enough for 2 men to work." "Could someone small get through? Someone smaller than your miners?" The men looked confused. Then Ezra realized what Ruth was thinking, and his blood turned cold. "No," he said immediately. "Absolutely not. You are not going in there." Ruth stood up, brushing dirt off her dress. "I'm the only one here with medical training. If those men are badly hurt, they need help right now, not after we spend hours digging them out safely. Ruth, that tunnel could collapse completely. Ezra argued. You could be killed. And those men will definitely die if someone doesn't help them soon, Ruth replied. She looked at Tom Bradley. Is there a way for someone my size to get through? Bradley looked uncomfortable. Maybe. There's a gap near the top of the rockfall that might be wide enough. But ma'am, with respect, that's no place for a lady. Good thing I'm not a lady then, Ruth said with a small smile. I'm a doctor. Before anyone could stop her, Ruth grabbed her medical bag and started climbing toward the gap in the rocks. Ezra caught her arm. Please don't do this, he said quietly. I can't lose someone else. Ruth's green eyes went soft. I know you're scared, but this is what I do, Ezra. This is who I am. I can't stand by and let people die when I might be able to help them. What if you'd be trying? Then at least I died doing something that mattered. She touched his cheek gently. But I don't plan on dying today. Ruth squeezed through the gap in the rocks, disappearing into the dark tunnel. For a moment, everything was quiet except for the sound of small stones falling. Then they heard her voice, muffled but clear. I'm through, I can see them. The next few minutes felt like hours. They could hear Ruth talking to the trapped miners, her voice calm and professional even in that dangerous place. She called out medical information. One man had a broken leg. The other was unconscious with a head wound. I need bandages and my extra medicine bag, Ruth called. Can someone pass them through? Ezra grabbed the supplies and climbed up to the gap. He had to lie flat on his belly to push the bag through the small opening. When his hand touched Ruth's inside the tunnel, he held on for just a moment longer than necessary. Be careful, he whispered. Always am, she whispered back. More time passed. The sun got higher and hotter. Some of the miners sat down in whatever shade they could find, while others kept trying to dig a safer way into the tunnel. Ezra paced back and forth like a caged animal, listening to every sound from inside the collapsed mine. Finally, Ruth's voice came again. The unconscious one is waking up. I think his head injury isn't as bad as it looked, but the other man's leg is broken in 3 places. I can splint it, but he's going to need help getting out of here. Can you both fit through that gap? Tom Bradley called. Not with his broken leg. We need to make the opening bigger, but carefully. Too much digging and the whole thing comes down on all of us. The miners worked for another hour, removing rocks one at a time, testing each move to make sure they weren't making things worse. Ezra helped, grateful to have something to do besides worry. When the opening was finally big enough, they pulled out the first injured miner, a young man named Peter, who had a bad bump on his head but could walk. Then came the second man, unconscious again but breathing steadily while Ruth supported his splinted leg. Last came Ruth herself, dirty and exhausted but smiling. Everyone's going to be fine, she announced. Peter needs to rest, and someone should watch him for signs of serious head injury. Jim's leg will take months to heal, but he'll walk normally again if he follows my instructions. The miners cheered and clapped. Several of them shook Ruth's hand, or patted her on the back like she was one of them. But Tom Bradley looked worried. Ma'am, we're grateful for what you did, he said. But Dr. Henderson is going to hear about this. He won't like that you went into that mine. Let me worry about Dr. Henderson, Ruth replied. Right now, let's focus on getting these injured men somewhere comfortable where I can keep an eye on them. They loaded the injured miners into Ezra's wagon and headed back to town. Along the way, Ruth sat close to Ezra on the driver's seat, and he could feel her trembling slightly from exhaustion and leftover fear. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen, he said quietly. It was the only thing to do, Ruth replied. Those men have families who need them, children who wait for their fathers to come home from work every day. Most people would have waited for someone else to figure out a safer way. Ruth was quiet for a moment, watching the desert landscape roll by. When I was little, maybe 8 years old, I fell through the ice on a pond near our house. The water was so cold I couldn't move, couldn't call for help. I was drowning. Ezra listened, steering his horses carefully around rocks in the road. My older brother saw me fall through. He could have run for help, but by the time adults came, I would have been dead. So he crawled out on that thin ice himself and pulled me to safety, nearly drowned doing it. Ruth smiled at the memory. That night, he told me something I've never forgotten. He said, sometimes being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what needs doing, even when you are scared. Smart brother. He was. He died in the war 3 years later. But what he taught me that day has guided my whole life. They rode in comfortable silence for a while. Then Ruth said, Ezra, I need to tell you something. Yesterday I got a telegram. There's been another outbreak of cholera, this time in Virginia City. It's worse than Carson City. They're asking for any doctor who can come help. Ezra's hands tightened on the reins. He'd been dreading this moment since the day Ruth arrived. Your horse is nearly healed. She could probably make the trip. Yes, she could. Ruth turned to look at him. But I don't want to go. Ezra's heart jumped. What do you mean? I mean, for the first time in years, I've found a place where I feel like I belong. Where people accept me for who I am and what I can do. Where I've met someone who... She stopped, her cheeks turning pink. Someone who what? Someone who makes me want to stay in one place for a while. They were almost back to Silver Creek now. Ezra could see the buildings coming into view, including his blacksmith shop where this whole adventure had started just a few days ago. Ruth, I need to tell you something too, he said. I haven't felt anything but sadness and loneliness since Martha died. Didn't think I ever would again. But these past few days with you, I feel like maybe there's hope for happiness again. Ruth reached over and took his hand. So what do we do about Virginia City? Before Ezra could answer, they saw a crowd gathered in front of his shop. Dr. Henderson was there, along with Sheriff Williams and several other important men from town. They all looked angry and determined. Looks like Dr. Henderson kept his promise about reporting you to the authorities, Ezra said grimly. Ruth straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. Then I guess we're about to find out how much this town really values what I've been doing here. As they pulled up in front of the shop, Ezra realized that everything was about to change. One way or another, this confrontation would decide Ruth's future in Silver Creek, and maybe his future too. Sheriff Williams stepped forward before Ezra even finished stopping his wagon, his hand resting on the gun at his side like he expected trouble. The crowd behind him included Dr. Henderson, Mayor Thompson, and several other men who made important decisions in Silver Creek. Their faces looked stern and disapproving, like parents about to scold a naughty child. Miss Calloway, the sheriff said formally, I need to speak with you about some serious complaints that have been filed. Ruth climbed down from the wagon with calm dignity, though Ezra could see her hands shaking slightly. Of course, Sheriff Williams. But first, could you help me get these injured miners somewhere comfortable? They need medical attention. That's exactly the problem, Dr. Henderson interrupted, stepping forward with his chest puffed out importantly. You have no legal right to provide medical attention to anyone. You're practicing medicine without proper licensing. I have medical training, Ruth replied evenly. I studied in San Francisco and worked in Army hospitals. Army field work is not the same as civilian practice, Henderson snapped. And even if it were, women are not permitted to practice medicine independently in Nevada territory. Mayor Thompson, a thin man with a carefully waxed mustache, cleared his throat. Miss Calloway, while we appreciate your intentions, the fact remains that you've been treating patients without proper authorization. This creates legal problems for our community. Ezra helped the injured miners down from his wagon, his anger growing with every word. Legal problems? These men would have died without her help. That's not the point, Mayor Thompson continued. We have established procedures, established practitioners. We can't have people just showing up and doing whatever they please. Even when what they please is saving lives? Ezra asked. Sheriff Williams held up his hand. Now, Ezra, I know you mean well, but this is a legal matter. Miss Calloway has been practicing medicine without a license. That's against territorial law. Ruth looked around at the faces surrounding her. Most looked stern and unfriendly. But Ezra noticed that some of the regular townspeople, the ones Ruth had treated, looked worried and upset. Mrs. Patterson stood at the edge of the crowd, holding little Tommy, whose burned hand Ruth had treated. Several of the miners from today's accident had followed them back to town and now stood watching the confrontation. Sheriff, Ruth said quietly, may I ask who filed these complaints? Dr. Henderson, of course, the sheriff replied. As the established medical practitioner in this region, he has every right to report illegal medical practice. And what exactly am I accused of doing illegally? Dr. Henderson pulled out a piece of paper and began reading in a loud, official voice. Setting broken bones without proper training, treating infections without medical supervision, dispensing medicines without a pharmacist's license, performing surgery without proper credentials. Surgery? Ruth looked puzzled. I haven't performed any surgery. You treated that miner's broken arm today, Henderson accused. That's medical treatment that should have been done by a licensed physician. I put splints on a broken bone, Ruth said. The same thing any mother would do for her child's broken finger. It's not the same thing at all. Henderson's voice rose angrily. You're misleading people into thinking you're a real doctor. I am a real doctor, Ruth replied firmly. Just because some laws haven't caught up with reality doesn't change my training or my ability to help people. The argument might have continued, but Mrs. Patterson suddenly pushed forward through the crowd. Now you just wait 1 minute, she said, her voice sharp with anger. Dr. Ruth saved my Tommy from a terrible burn. His hand is healing perfectly, and she didn't charge me a penny. That's beside the point, Mrs. Patterson, Mayor Thompson said dismissively. The law is the law. The law is stupid if it stops good people from helping folks who need help, Mrs. Patterson shot back. Other voices joined in. Carlos, the miner with the broken arm, struggled to stand up from where Ezra had helped him sit down. This lady, doctor, she saved my life today. She went into that dangerous mine when no one else would. Are you going to arrest her for that? She had no business going into that mine, Dr. Henderson said. It was dangerous and foolish. It was brave and necessary, Tom Bradley corrected, stepping forward from the group of miners. My men would be dead right now if not for her. Sheriff Williams looked uncomfortable. This wasn't going the way he'd expected. Look, folks, I understand you're grateful, but I've got to uphold the law. Ms. Calloway, I'm going to have to ask you to stop treating patients until this matter can be resolved properly. And how long will that take? Ruth asked. Could be weeks, maybe months, the sheriff admitted. We'll have to send papers to the territorial capital, get official rulings. People will die while you're shuffling papers, Ezra said bluntly. That's not our problem, Dr. Henderson declared. If people need medical care, they can come to me in Carson City. Carson City is 50 miles away, Mrs. Patterson protested. What if there's an emergency? What if someone gets hurt bad and can't travel that far? Then they should have thought of that before settling in such a remote location, Henderson replied coldly. The crowd murmured angrily at that. These were hard-working people who'd come to Silver Creek to build new lives, to mine silver and raise families and create a community. They couldn't just pack up and move closer to Carson City every time someone got sick or injured. Young Billy Thompson suddenly spoke up from the back of the crowd. My ankle was twisted so bad I couldn't walk. Dr. Ruth fixed it, and now it's good as new. She didn't hurt me. She helped me. I don't care if she helped you or not, Dr. Henderson said impatiently. She's not licensed to practice medicine, and that's final. What exactly does it take to get licensed? Ruth asked. Henderson smiled unpleasantly. Well, first you'd need to be a man. Nevada Territory doesn't license women doctors. That's not fair. Several voices called out. Fair has nothing to do with it, Henderson replied. It's the law. Ezra had heard enough. He stepped forward, placing himself between Ruth and Dr. Henderson. Dr. Henderson, you're a small, petty man who's more worried about protecting your territory than helping people. Miss Calloway has done more good in this town in 1 week than you've done in 30 years. How dare you? Henderson sputtered. I'll have you arrested for interfering with legal proceedings. On what charge? Ezra asked. Standing up for someone who actually cares about people? Sheriff Williams stepped between them. That's enough. Both of you. This isn't helping anyone. You're right, Ruth said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. This argument isn't helping the people who need medical care. She walked over to her medical bag and began packing it up. Sheriff Williams, I'll comply with your request. I won't treat any more patients until this legal matter is resolved. Ruth, no, Ezra protested. Don't let them bully you. I'm not being bullied, Ruth replied calmly. I'm being practical. She looked directly at Dr. Henderson. But I have one question, doctor. If there's a medical emergency while we're waiting for the territorial authorities to make their decision, will you guarantee to be available immediately? Henderson looked uncomfortable. I have a practice in Carson City. I can't abandon my patients there to sit around here waiting for emergencies that might never happen. So you're saying that for the next several weeks or months, the people of Silver Creek will have no medical care at all? They'll have to make do, just like they did before you arrived. Ruth nodded thoughtfully. I see. And if someone dies during that time? If a child gets sick, or there's another mining accident, or a woman goes into difficult labor, you're comfortable with that responsibility? It's not my responsibility, Henderson said, but his voice was less confident now. People choose to live in remote places. They have to accept the risks, even when those risks could be prevented. Henderson didn't answer. Ruth finished packing her medical bag and stood up. Very well. I'll stop practicing medicine in Silver Creek immediately. She looked around at the crowd of people who had become her patients and friends. I'm sorry. I wish things could be different. Mrs. Patterson started crying. Several of the miners cursed under their breath. Even some of the town officials looked uncomfortable with how this was playing out. However, Ruth continued, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd, I'll be staying at the boarding house for a few more days while my horse finishes healing. If anyone wants to visit me there just to talk, as friends, I suppose there's no law against that. The meaning was clear to everyone. Ruth couldn't officially treat patients, but she could still give advice and help as a friend and neighbor. Dr. Henderson's face turned red. That's just another way of practicing medicine illegally. Is it illegal to bandage a friend's cut? Ruth asked innocently. Is it against the law to help a neighbor who's feeling sick? You know exactly what I mean. I know exactly what you're trying to do, Ruth replied. You're trying to protect your monopoly on medical care, even if it means people suffer. Sheriff Williams looked tired. Miss Calloway, just be careful about how you interpret the law, all right? I don't want to have to arrest you. I understand, Sheriff. I'll be very careful to stay within the law. As the crowd began to break up, people came over to Ruth one by one. Some thanked her quietly. Others promised to visit her at the boarding house if they needed to talk. Miss Patterson hugged her and whispered something in her ear that made Ruth smile. Dr. Henderson stalked off toward his horse, muttering angrily. Mayor Thompson and the other officials followed him, looking uncomfortable with the whole situation. When most people had left, Ezra helped Ruth carry her things to the boarding house. They walked in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. I'm sorry, Ezra said finally. I should have done more to protect you. You did everything you could, Ruth replied. Besides, this isn't over yet. What do you mean? Ruth smiled, and for the first time all day, she looked truly happy. Did you see how many people stood up for me? How angry they got at the idea of losing medical care? Yeah, but what good does that do if the law is against you? Laws can be changed, Ezra. And in the meantime, I'm not going anywhere. They reached the boarding house, and Ruth turned to face him. Besides, I've got something worth fighting for now. What's that? A reason to stay in one place. A community that needs me. And maybe, if I'm very lucky, a blacksmith who might be interested in more than just fixing my horse's shoes. Ezra felt his heart speed up. Ruth, Don't say anything now, she interrupted gently. We've both got a lot to think about, but know this, I'm not giving up. Not on being a doctor, not on this town, and not on other possibilities. As she walked into the boarding house, Ezra realized that the fight for Ruth's right to practice medicine was just beginning. But for the first time since Martha died, he had something worth fighting for too. And he wasn't going to let anyone take it away without a battle. The scream that split the night air sent ice through Ezra's veins as he bolted upright in bed. Outside his small house behind the blacksmith shop, chaos erupted in the darkness. Horses neighing in terror, men shouting, and underneath it all, a woman's voice crying for help. He pulled on his pants and boots faster than he'd ever moved in his life, grabbing his rifle from beside the door. Fire! Fire at the Henderson place! Someone yelled from the street. Ezra ran toward the orange glow lighting up the sky 2 blocks away. The wooden house where Mrs. Henderson ran the boarding house was already half covered in flames, smoke pouring from broken windows. A bucket brigade had formed, but everyone could see it was too late to save the building. Where's Mrs. Henderson? Ezra shouted over the noise. Got out safe, Tom Bradley called back, passing another bucket of water. But there's still someone inside. That lady doctor, she went back in for something. Ezra's blood turned to ice water. Ruth was inside that burning building. Without thinking, he dropped his rifle and ran toward the front door. The heat hit him like a physical wall, and smoke burned his eyes and throat. Ruth, he yelled. Ruth, where are you? Upstairs. Her voice came from somewhere above, weak and coughing. "I can't. The stairs are blocked." Ezra looked up the main staircase and saw it was already burning, flames licking at the wooden steps. But there was a back stairway that might still be passable. He soaked his shirt in a bucket of water and wrapped it around his face, then plunged into the smoke-filled building. The back stairs were hot but not yet burning. He took them 2 at a time, calling Ruth's name. Upstairs, the hallway was full of thick, choking smoke that made it almost impossible to see. "Ruth, keep talking so I can find you. Here, 3rd door on the right. But Ezra, don't come in here. The floor might collapse." He found her room and saw immediately why she was trapped. A burning beam had fallen across the doorway, blocking her exit. Ruth was pressed against the far window, her dress torn and her face streaked with soot. "Stand back!" Ezra yelled. He grabbed the burning beam with his bare hands, ignoring the searing pain, and threw it aside. The smell of his own burned flesh mixed with the smoke. Ruth stumbled toward him, clutching her black medical bag. "I had to get this," she gasped. "All my medicines, my instruments. People need them." "Forget the bag." Ezra grabbed her hand. "We need to get out now." But as they reached the hallway, they heard a terrible groaning sound. The floor beneath their feet started to sag. "The whole 2nd floor is going to collapse," Ruth said, her eyes wide with terror. Ezra looked around desperately. The back stairs were now blocked by fallen debris. The front stairs were fully engulfed in flames. But the window at the end of the hall faced the alley, and there was a water trough directly below. "Can you swim?" he asked. "What does that have to do with anything?" "We're going to jump." Ruth looked out the window at the 2-story drop. "That's insane." "Not as insane as burning to death." Ezra kicked out the window glass with his boot. "Trust me." The floor groaned again and tilted dangerously. Ruth grabbed Ezra's hand. "If we die, I want you to know something. Tell me when we're on the ground." They jumped together, falling through the night air with flames reaching out behind them like grasping fingers. They hit the water trough with a tremendous splash, and Ezra felt his shoulder twist painfully as they went under. When they surfaced, gasping and choking, a crowd of people rushed to help them out of the water. Mrs. Henderson wrapped blankets around both of them, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. "You crazy fools," she scolded them. "You could have been killed." "Are you hurt?" Ruth asked Ezra, seeing him wince as he moved his left arm. "Shoulders dislocated, I think. Nothing that won't heal." He looked at her more carefully. "What about you?" "Some burns on my hands from the doorknob, but I'm fine." Ruth opened her medical bag to check that everything had survived the fall. "At least, I saved my supplies." "Why did you risk your life for a bag of medicines?" Mrs. Henderson asked. Ruth looked up from examining her instruments. "Because tomorrow, there might be someone who needs these things to live. I couldn't let them burn when I could prevent it." Dr. Henderson chose that moment to arrive on the scene, riding his horse hard from Carson City. He dismounted and surveyed the burning building with satisfaction rather than concern. "Well," he said loudly, "I suppose this solves our problem with illegal medical practice. No more place for our pretend doctor to operate from." The crowd that had gathered to fight the fire turned to stare at him. Their faces showed shock and disgust at his callous words. "Dr. Henderson, Mrs. Patterson said coldly, that woman just risked her life to save her medical supplies so she could keep helping people. And you're celebrating because her temporary office burned down?" "I'm celebrating because the law will finally be respected," Henderson replied. "Miss Calloway has no legal right to practice medicine, and now she has no base of operations either. Perhaps she'll finally accept reality and leave town." Ezra stepped forward, his jaw tight with anger despite the pain in his shoulder. "Dr. Henderson, you're a sorry excuse for a man, let alone a doctor. Ruth just saved lives tonight while you were safely tucked in your bed 50 miles away." "I saved lives?" Ruth looked confused. "How? I didn't treat anyone." "You saved your medical supplies," Tom Bradley explained. "Which means when the next emergency comes, and there will be one, you'll be ready to help. That's exactly the kind of thinking that needs to stop," Dr. Henderson declared. "There will be no more emergencies treated by unlicensed personnel. I've sent word to the territorial marshal. Miss Calloway will be arrested if she treats even one more patient." "Even in a life or death emergency?" Ruth asked. "Even then, the law is clear." Sheriff Williams, who had been helping with the fire, walked over to join the conversation. He looked tired and troubled. "Dr. Henderson, I got your message about involving the territorial marshal. Are you sure that's necessary? Miss Calloway has been cooperating with our requests." "She's been finding ways around the law," Henderson accused. "Treating patients under the guise of friendly visits. It has to stop." "What if someone dies because medical help was refused?" Ezra asked. Henderson shrugged. "That's not my responsibility. People choose to live in remote areas. They must accept the consequences." The crowd murmured angrily. These were the same people Henderson expected to serve if they could afford the long, expensive trip to Carson City. Ruth stood up slowly, her wet dress clinging to her and her hair still dripping from their jump into the water trough. She looked around at all the faces watching her, some friendly, some hostile, all waiting to see what she would do. "Dr. Henderson," she said quietly, "you're absolutely right about one thing. I have been finding ways around the law to help people, but I want you to understand why." She walked over to where Carlos sat on a wooden crate, his splinted arm cradled against his chest. This man would have died in that mine collapse if I hadn't been there to treat him. Not because his injuries were untreatable, but because no licensed doctor was available. She moved to Mrs. Patterson, who still held little Tommy in her arms. "This child would have permanent scars from his burn if I hadn't treated it immediately with proper medicine. Not because the injury was too severe, but because the nearest licensed doctor was too far away." Ruth faced Henderson directly. "I've been a doctor for 8 years. I've delivered dozens of babies, set hundreds of broken bones, and treated every kind of injury and illness you can imagine. I know what I'm doing, and I'm good at it. The only difference between us is that you have a piece of paper from the territorial government, and I don't. That piece of paper represents years of proper training and legal authority," Henderson replied. "Without it, you're just a woman playing at medicine." "Then test me," Ruth said suddenly. Everyone fell silent. Even the crackling of the dying fire seemed to quiet down. "What did you say?" Henderson asked. "I said test me. Right here, right now, in front of all these witnesses. Ask me any medical question you want. Test my knowledge, my diagnostic skills, my surgical techniques. If I can't prove that I know as much about medicine as you do, I'll leave Silver Creek tonight and never practice medicine again anywhere in Nevada Territory." Henderson looked uncertain for the first time that evening. That's highly irregular. "So is denying medical care to people who need it," Ruth replied. "But I'm willing to put my reputation on the line. Are you?" Ezra realized what Ruth was doing. She was forcing Henderson to either admit publicly that she was qualified, or reveal that he was afraid to test her knowledge against his own. "This is ridiculous," Henderson sputtered. "I don't have to prove anything to anyone." "No, you don't," Ruth agreed, "but I do, and I'm willing to do it." Sheriff Williams stepped forward. "Dr. Henderson, seems like a fair proposal to me. If Miss Calloway can prove she knows medicine as well as you do, maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement." "There is no arrangement," Henderson snapped. "The law is the law. Laws can be interpreted," the sheriff replied, "and they can be changed if circumstances warrant it." Henderson looked around at the crowd of people, all watching him expectantly. He was trapped, and everyone knew it. If he refused Ruth's challenge, he would look like a coward. If he accepted and she proved to be as knowledgeable as he claimed to be, his argument about unqualified women would fall apart. "Fine," he said finally. "But when I prove that this woman knows nothing about real medicine, I want everyone here to witness that she has no business treating sick people." Ruth nodded calmly. "Agreed. And when I prove that I do know medicine, I want you to support my application for a medical license." "That's impossible. Nevada Territory doesn't license women." "Then maybe it's time that changed," Ruth replied. As the crowd gathered closer to witness this unprecedented medical showdown, Ezra felt a mixture of pride and terror. Ruth was risking everything on her knowledge and skills. If she failed, she would lose any chance of practicing medicine in Silver Creek or anywhere else in the territory. But if she succeeded, she might change not just her own future, but the future of women doctors everywhere. The burned-out boarding house cast flickering shadows over the assembled crowd as two doctors prepared to face off in a contest that would determine Ruth's fate, and possibly the fate of everyone in Silver Creek who might someday need medical care. "We'll start with something simple," Dr. Henderson announced, pulling a small leather notebook from his coat pocket. as dawn light began to creep across the smoky sky. The crowd had moved to the town square, where oil lamps provided enough light for everyone to see clearly. Ruth stood calmly in the center, her medical bag at her feet, while Henderson paced around her like a predator circling prey. "Tell me the symptoms of appendicitis," Henderson commanded, his voice loud and confident. Ruth didn't hesitate. Sharp pain beginning around the navel and moving to the lower right abdomen, nausea and vomiting, low fever that increases over time, tenderness when pressure is applied to McBurney's point, approximately 1/3 the distance from the right hip bone to the navel. Henderson frowned slightly. He'd clearly expected her to stumble on the first question. Anyone could memorize symptoms from a medical book. Let's try something more challenging. A patient comes to you with chest pain. How do you determine if it's a heart attack or something less serious? "First, I assess the quality and location of the pain," Ruth replied steadily. "Heart attack pain is typically crushing or squeezing, often described as feeling like an elephant sitting on the chest. It may radiate to the left arm, jaw, or back. I check for accompanying symptoms: shortness of breath, nausea, sweating, sense of impending doom." She continued without pausing. "I examine skin color and temperature, check pulse quality and rhythm, listen to heart sounds for irregularities. If available, I administer nitroglycerin. If it relieves the pain, that suggests heart involvement. Most importantly, I consider the patient's age, medical history, and risk factors like diabetes or previous heart problems." Several people in the crowd nodded appreciatively. Even some who had been skeptical of Ruth's abilities looked impressed. Henderson's confidence wavered, but he pressed on. "Surgery. You claim to have surgical experience. Describe the proper procedure for removing a bullet from a patient's abdomen." This was dangerous territory. Surgery was considered the most exclusively male domain of medicine. If Ruth failed here, her credibility would be destroyed. "First, I ensure the patient is properly anesthetized. Chloroform or ether if available, laudanum if not," Ruth began, her voice steady and professional. "I examine the entry wound to determine the bullet's likely path, taking into account the angle of entry and the patient's position when shot." She knelt and opened her medical bag, pulling out surgical instruments as she spoke. "I sterilize all instruments in boiling water and clean the surgical site with carbolic acid to prevent infection, a technique developed by Dr. Lister that many physicians still refuse to accept." Henderson snorted. Lister's theories about invisible germs are nonsense. Everyone knows bad air causes infection. "Actually," Ruth said calmly, "Dr. Lister's antiseptic techniques have dramatically reduced surgical mortality rates in hospitals where they're properly implemented. I've seen the results firsthand." She continued her explanation, using her instruments to demonstrate proper surgical technique on an imaginary patient. "I make the incision following the bullet's probable path, using retractors to hold tissues apart while minimizing damage. I probe carefully. Bullets can be deflected by bones or organs, ending up far from where you'd expect." The crowd watched in fascination as Ruth's hands moved with practiced precision, explaining each step of the procedure. Even Ezra, who had seen her work before, was amazed by her knowledge and skill. "Once I locate the bullet, I remove it carefully to avoid causing additional damage," Ruth concluded. "Then I check for internal bleeding, repair any damaged organs or blood vessels, and close the incision in layers. Post-operative care includes monitoring for signs of infection and keeping the wound clean and dry." Henderson looked frustrated. Ruth had answered perfectly, demonstrating not just knowledge, but practical experience. "Anyone can describe procedures," he said dismissively. "Let's see how you handle a real patient." "I'm not allowed to treat patients, remember?" Ruth replied sweetly. "You made sure of that." "Then we'll use a volunteer," Henderson decided. He looked around the crowd. "Someone with a genuine medical condition that needs attention." Old Pete stepped forward, unwrapping the bandage on his infected finger. "My cut's gotten worse since you stopped the lady from treating it," he said to Henderson. "Been throbbing something fierce. And look here, red streaks going up my arm." Henderson examined Pete's finger dismissively. "Simple infection. Needs to be drained and cleaned. Any fool could handle it." "Then let Miss Calloway handle it," Sheriff Williams suggested. "If it's so simple, what harm could there be?" Henderson looked trapped again. "She's not licensed. This is a medical test, not treatment," Ruth pointed out. You wanted to see my practical skills. Reluctantly, Henderson agreed. Ruth immediately went to work, cleaning Pete's infected finger with gentle thoroughness. As she worked, she explained her actions to the watching crowd. You can see the red streaking extending up toward his wrist, she said, pointing to the inflamed lines on Pete's arm. That indicates the infection is spreading through his lymphatic system. Left untreated, this could lead to blood poisoning and death. She cleaned the wound carefully, then applied a poultice made from herbs in her medical bag. This combination of golden seal and echinacea will help fight the infection naturally while drawing out the poison. Herbal remedies are old wives' tales, Henderson scoffed. Real medicine uses proven treatments. Like what? Ruth asked. What would you prescribe for Pete's infection? Henderson looked uncomfortable. Well, leeches to draw out the bad blood, and perhaps mercury treatments to purify his system. Several people in the crowd gasped. Mercury treatments were known to be dangerous, often causing more harm than good. Mercury is a poison, Ruth said firmly. It would likely kill Pete faster than the infection would, and leeches would weaken him when he needs his strength to fight off the disease. She finished bandaging Pete's finger with clean cloth. Natural remedies have been used successfully for thousands of years. Many modern medicines are derived from plants that traditional healers have used for generations. Pete flexed his finger experimentally. Already feels better, he announced. Pain's not near as bad. Henderson's face was getting red with embarrassment and anger. This proves nothing. One lucky guess doesn't make someone a doctor. Then let's try another test, Ruth suggested. Bring me any medical case you consider difficult, and I'll diagnose and treat it. Fine, Henderson snapped. He looked around the crowd and spotted Jake Morrison, the carpenter with the broken arm that Ruth had treated earlier. You, come here. Jake approached reluctantly, his arm still in the splint Ruth had applied. Remove that splint, Henderson ordered. I want to examine how this supposed doctor set your broken arm. Dr. Henderson, Jake protested. She told me not to remove it for at least 3 more weeks. I'm a real doctor, and I'm telling you to remove it now. Jake looked uncertainly at Ruth, who nodded sadly. It's all right, Jake. Let him examine it. Henderson cut away the splint with unnecessary roughness, causing Jake to wince in pain. He manipulated the healing arm, pressing and prodding without concern for Jake's discomfort. Henderson muttered, clearly disappointed. The bones appear to be properly aligned. Healing seems to be progressing normally. Of course it is, Ruth said quietly. I know how to set broken bones. Henderson replaced the splint carelessly, causing Jake to cry out in pain. Anyone can get lucky occasionally, he insisted. But the crowd had seen enough. Even people who had been skeptical of Ruth were now openly supportive. Henderson's rough treatment of Jake, combined with his dangerous suggestions about mercury and leeches, had turned public opinion against him. Dr. Henderson, Mayor Thompson said carefully, it seems to me that Miss Calloway has demonstrated considerable medical knowledge and skill. She's demonstrated nothing but lucky guesses and folk remedies. Henderson replied angrily. What about her surgical knowledge? Tom Bradley asked. That wasn't lucky guessing. She knew things about surgery that most people never heard of. Book learning, Henderson insisted. Anyone can memorize facts from medical texts. Then how do you explain her experience in army hospitals? Mrs. Patterson challenged. She didn't learn surgery from books. She learned it from saving soldiers' lives. Henderson was clearly losing control of the situation. The crowd that had been neutral or even hostile toward Ruth was now solidly on her side. His own behavior, arrogant, dismissive, and needlessly cruel to patients, had backfired completely. This whole test is meaningless, he declared. Nevada territorial law is clear. Women cannot be licensed to practice medicine. Maybe that law needs to be changed? Sheriff Williams said thoughtfully. If Miss Calloway knows as much about medicine as any licensed doctor, what sense does it make to prevent her from helping people? The law exists for good reasons, Henderson protested. What reasons? Ruth asked calmly. Other than the belief that women are somehow naturally inferior to men? Henderson's face turned purple with rage. Women are emotional, irrational creatures. They lack the mental capacity for serious medical study. They're too weak and delicate for the demands of medical practice. The women in the crowd bristled at his words. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward angrily. Weak and delicate? I've birthed 4 children, raised them through every childhood illness, and kept my family healthy for 20 years. Don't you dare call me weak." Other women voiced similar protests. Even some of the men looked uncomfortable with Henderson's extreme statements. Ruth waited for the noise to die down, then spoke quietly. "Dr. Henderson, I've demonstrated that I have extensive medical knowledge, practical surgical experience, and the ability to treat patients successfully. I've risked my life to save medical supplies that help people. I've gone into a dangerous mine to rescue injured men. I've treated everyone who came to me, regardless of their ability to pay." She paused, looking around at the faces surrounding her. "What more do I need to prove to earn the right to help people who need medical care?" Henderson had no answer. His face was still red with anger, but he seemed to realize that he'd lost this battle completely. "This isn't over," he said finally. "The territorial marshal will be here within the week. We'll see how much your local popularity matters when federal law gets involved." As he stalked away toward his horse, the crowd began to disperse. People came up to Ruth one by one, shaking her hand or patting her shoulder. Several offered their homes as temporary places for her to continue her medical work. Ezra waited until most people had left, then approached Ruth with concern. "You were incredible tonight," he said. "But Henderson's right about one thing. The territorial marshal is coming. This might get worse before it gets better." Ruth looked tired but determined. "Then we'll face whatever comes next. Together, if you're willing." "I'm willing," Ezra said immediately. "But Ruth, what if the federal authorities side with Henderson? What if they really do arrest you?" Ruth smiled, and despite everything they'd been through, her eyes held hope rather than fear. "Then at least we'll know we fought for what was right. Sometimes that's all you can do." As the sun came up over Silver Creek, painting the sky pink and gold above the ruins of the boarding house, Ezra realized that everything was about to change. The territorial marshal would bring federal authority to bear on their small-town dispute. But he also realized that Ruth had already won the most important battle. She'd won the hearts and minds of the people she served. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The sound of approaching horses thundered through Silver Creek like an earthquake, dust clouds rising behind 3 riders who wore the silver badges of territorial marshals. Ezra dropped his hammer and rushed from his forge to see what looked like trouble riding straight toward his shop, where Ruth sat calmly treating Mrs. Garcia's sick baby, despite the legal threats hanging over her head. "Ruth Calloway," the lead marshal called out, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. He was a tall, lean man with gray hair and cold blue eyes that had seen too much of the world's ugliness. "I'm Marshal Blake Stevens. You're under arrest for practicing medicine without proper licensing." Ruth looked up from the baby she was examining, her face calm but her hands trembling slightly. "May I finish treating this child first? She has a dangerous fever that could turn deadly if left untreated." "You'll step away from that patient immediately," Marshal Stevens commanded, dismounting from his horse with practiced efficiency. "Any further medical treatment will be considered additional criminal activity." Mrs. Garcia, a young mother who spoke broken English mixed with Spanish, clutched her baby tighter. "Por favor, please. My Nina is very sick. The lady doctor, she knows how to help." "Ma'am, you'll need to take your child to a properly licensed physician," Stevens replied, though his voice softened slightly when he looked at the worried mother. "The nearest licensed doctor is 50 miles away in Carson City," Ezra said, stepping forward. "By the time they get there and back, this baby could be dead." "That's not my concern," Stevens replied. "My job is to enforce federal law, not make medical decisions." Ruth stood slowly, setting down her medical instruments with careful precision. "Marshal Stevens, I understand you're doing your job, but before you arrest me, could you answer one question?" Stevens looked suspicious. "What kind of question?" "If your own child was dying, and I was the only person available with the medical knowledge to save that child's life, would you still prevent me from helping?" The marshal's jaw tightened. "The law doesn't make exceptions for personal feelings, Miss Calloway. I'm not asking about the law. I'm asking about what's right." Before Stevens could answer, Dr. Henderson rode up with a satisfied smile on his face. "Marshal Stevens, thank you for coming so quickly. As you can see, this woman continues to ignore our previous warnings about illegal medical practice." "Dr. Henderson sent word about the situation," Stevens confirmed. "Says you've been treating patients despite being ordered to stop." "I've been helping people who need help," Ruth replied simply. The same thing any decent person would do. Decent people respect the law, Henderson interjected smugly. They don't arrogantly assume they know better than established legal authority. A crowd was gathering, drawn by the presence of federal marshals in their small town. Mrs. Patterson arrived with little Tommy, whose burned hand had healed perfectly under Ruth's care. Tom Bradley came from the mine, still wearing his work clothes. Jake Morrison appeared with his arm in Ruth's splint, healing properly despite Henderson's rough examination. Marshal, Mrs. Patterson called out, this woman saved my son from terrible scarring. She's helped half the people in this town. And she's done it all illegally, Henderson added quickly. Without proper training, without oversight, without regard for patient safety. Patient safety? Tom Bradley laughed harshly. She risked her own life to save my miners from that cave. When did you ever risk anything to help people, Henderson? Stevens held up his hand for silence. This isn't a debate about medical qualifications. This is about following territorial law. Miss Calloway, you're under arrest for practicing medicine without a license. You have the right to remain silent. Wait, Ruth said, reaching into her medical bag. I have something you need to see. Stevens tensed, his hand moving toward his gun. Step away from that bag, ma'am. It's just papers, Ruth said calmly. Documents that might change your understanding of this situation. She pulled out a folded piece of official-looking paper with ribbons and seals. This is my medical license from the state of California, issued 2 years ago after I passed their medical examination. Everyone stared at the document. Henderson's face went white as fresh snow. California recognizes women physicians, Ruth continued. I'm fully licensed to practice medicine under California law. But this is Nevada territory, Henderson protested weakly. California licenses aren't valid here. Actually, Marshal Stevens said, studying the document carefully, interstate medical reciprocity is a complicated legal issue. Territorial law isn't entirely clear on whether licenses from other states should be recognized. It's perfectly clear, Henderson insisted desperately. Nevada territory doesn't license women doctors. Therefore, women can't practice medicine here. But if she's already licensed in another state, Stevens mused, that suggests she has legitimate medical training and qualifications. Ruth reached into her bag again. I also have these letters of recommendation from Dr. William Morrison in San Francisco, Colonel James Mitchell, who commanded the military hospital where I served, and Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell from the Women's Medical College in New York. Stevens read through the letters, his expression growing more thoughtful. These are impressive credentials, Miss Calloway. Why didn't you present them earlier? Because I shouldn't need special permission to help people, Ruth replied. A drowning person doesn't ask to see their rescuer's swimming certificate. This is outrageous, Henderson exploded. She's been hiding these documents to make us look foolish. Dr. Henderson, Stevens said quietly, did you investigate Miss Calloway's background before filing your complaint? Henderson shifted uncomfortably. I assumed that any woman claiming to be a doctor was obviously unqualified. You assumed, Stevens repeated. Based on what evidence? Based on the fact that women aren't doctors, Henderson replied. Everyone knows that. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward angrily. Everyone except the woman who delivered my youngest son when the midwife couldn't come. Everyone except the woman who saved Tommy's hand from permanent scarring. Everyone except the woman who went into a burning building to save her medical supplies so she could keep helping people. Other voices joined in, telling stories of Ruth's medical interventions, her skill and dedication, her refusal to charge poor families for treatment. With each story, Henderson looked smaller and more desperate. None of that matters, he insisted. The law is the law. But which law? Stevens asked. Federal law recognizes medical licenses issued by state governments. If Miss Calloway is licensed in California, she may have legal standing to practice medicine anywhere in the United States. That's not how it works, Henderson stammered. Actually, Dr. Henderson, I'm not sure you're qualified to interpret federal law, Stevens replied dryly. That's why we have courts and judges. Ruth stepped forward. Marshal Stevens, I have a proposal. Instead of arresting me, why don't you send my credentials to the territorial capital for official review? If the authorities determine that my California license isn't valid in Nevada, I'll stop practicing medicine immediately. And if they determine it is valid? Stevens asked. Then Dr. Henderson owes this community an apology for trying to deny them medical care based on his personal prejudices. Henderson's face was now bright red with embarrassment and anger. This is all legal trickery. She's still just a woman playing at being a doctor. Dr. Henderson? Stevens said with growing irritation. I've read these credentials. Miss Calloway clearly has extensive medical training and experience. Your continued insistence that women can't be doctors is starting to sound less like legal concern and more like personal bias. It's not bias. It's biology, Henderson protested. Women's brains are smaller. They're too emotional for rational medical decisions. They lack the physical strength for surgery. The women in the crowd began murmuring angrily. Even some of the men looked uncomfortable with Henderson's extreme statements. Ruth remained calm. Dr. Henderson, would you like to test those theories? We could have another medical examination, this time with Marshal Stevens as an impartial observer. I don't need to prove anything to you, Henderson snapped. No, but you might need to prove something to the territorial authorities, Stevens said thoughtfully. Miss Calloway, I'm going to defer your arrest pending official review of your credentials. Dr. Henderson, I strongly suggest you prepare documentation supporting your complaint, because if this case goes to court, you'll need more than personal opinions about women's capabilities. Henderson looked stunned. You're not arresting her? Not until I receive official word about the validity of her medical license, Stevens confirmed. Miss Calloway, you may continue treating patients, but keep detailed records of all your medical activities. If this goes to trial, that documentation will be important. Thank you, Marshal, Ruth said gratefully. I'll maintain complete records. As the marshals prepared to leave, Stevens pulled Ruth aside for a private conversation. Miss Calloway, I want you to understand something. I have 2 daughters, and I hope they'll have opportunities to use their talents in whatever way they choose. But I also have to uphold the law, even when I personally disagree with it. I understand, Marshal. You're being fair, and I appreciate that. Dr. Henderson made some serious accusations about your qualifications. Are you confident that your credentials will stand up to official scrutiny? Ruth smiled. Marshal, I've delivered over 200 babies, performed dozens of surgical procedures, and treated every kind of injury and illness you can imagine. My credentials will stand up to any scrutiny. Stevens nodded approvingly. Then I suspect Dr. Henderson is about to learn an expensive lesson about making assumptions. After the marshals rode away, the crowd began to celebrate. Ruth was safe, at least temporarily, and there was hope that her medical license would be officially recognized. But Henderson wasn't finished. As people began to disperse, he approached Ruth with cold determination in his eyes. You think you've won? He said quietly. But I know things about you that these simple people don't. I know why you really left California. I know about the patient who died under your care. Ruth's face went pale. What are you talking about? I have friends in medical circles, Miss Calloway. I know about the malpractice accusations. I know about the family that blamed you for their son's death. When that information reaches the territorial authorities, your precious license won't protect you. Henderson smiled cruelly. Enjoy your temporary victory. It won't last long. As he walked away, Ruth stood frozen in shock. Ezra approached, concerned by her sudden change in demeanor. Ruth, what did Henderson say to you? She looked at him with eyes full of pain and fear. He knows about San Francisco. About the patient I couldn't save. What patient? Ruth's voice was barely a whisper. The one whose death destroyed my practice and drove me from California. The one whose death I've been running from ever since. Ezra realized that despite all of Ruth's victories today, the real battle was just beginning. Henderson had found her weakness, her secret shame, and he was prepared to use it to destroy her completely. Tell me what happened in San Francisco, Ezra said gently, leading Ruth to a quiet spot behind his blacksmith shop, where they could talk without being overheard. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the desert, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled lazily in the clear sky. Ruth sat on an old wooden crate, her hands folded in her lap, looking smaller and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. His name was Timothy Brennan, Ruth began, her voice so quiet Ezra had to lean closer to hear. He was 16 years old, the only son of one of San Francisco's wealthiest families. They brought him to me because their regular doctor was out of town, and Timothy had been sick for 3 days with terrible stomach pain. She paused, staring at her hands. I examined him carefully. All the symptoms pointed to appendicitis. The pain, the fever, the location of the tenderness. I told his parents he needed surgery immediately, or the appendix would burst and he would die. Ezra waited patiently, sensing there was more to the story. But Mr. Brennan didn't trust a woman doctor to operate on his son, Ruth continued. He said surgery was too dangerous, too complicated for someone like me. He wanted to wait for their family doctor to return from his trip to Sacramento. What did you do? I begged him to reconsider. I explained that we had maybe 12 hours before the appendix would rupture. I offered to assist their regular doctor when he returned, but I insisted that waiting was too dangerous. Ruth's voice grew even quieter. Mr. Brennan accused me of trying to scare them into unnecessary surgery. He said women doctors always overreacted because we were too emotional to make rational decisions. Ezra felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. So they ignored your advice? They took Timothy home. Mrs. Brennan wanted to listen to me, but her husband overruled her. He said he wouldn't let some woman experiment on his son. Ruth wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. 18 hours later, Timothy's appendix ruptured. By the time they brought him back to me, the infection had spread throughout his abdomen. I operated anyway, but it was too late. That wasn't your fault, Ezra said firmly. You gave them the right advice. They chose not to follow it. That's what I told myself, Ruth replied. But the Brennan family didn't see it that way. Mr. Brennan filed a complaint with the medical board, claiming I had misdiagnosed his son and performed unnecessary surgery that killed him. He used his wealth and influence to turn other doctors against me. But surely the medical board could see that you'd tried to help? Ruth laughed bitterly. The medical board consisted entirely of men who already resented having women in their profession. They saw this as an opportunity to prove that women couldn't handle the responsibilities of medicine. They launched a formal investigation, and suddenly none of my colleagues would associate with me. Patients stopped coming. Other doctors refused to consult with me. She stood up and began pacing, her emotions finally breaking through her usual calm demeanor. The worst part was the newspapers. They printed stories about the lady doctor who had killed a prominent family's son through her incompetence and arrogance. They said it proved that women should stick to nursing and leave real medicine to men. So you left San Francisco? I had no choice. My practice was ruined, my reputation destroyed. Even though the medical board eventually cleared me of wrongdoing, the damage was done. Nobody would trust a woman doctor who had been publicly accused of malpractice, even if the accusations were proven false. Ezra absorbed this information, understanding now why Ruth had chosen the lonely life of a traveling doctor. Is that why you've been moving from town to town? Because you're afraid the story will follow you? Partly, but also because I discovered something important during that terrible time. I learned that there are places where people care more about getting help than about who provides it. Small towns where a sick child matters more than medical politics. Communities where people judge you by what you do, not by what others say about you. Ruth turned to face him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. Ezra, I need you to know something. Timothy Brennan's death wasn't my fault, but it was my failure. I failed to convince his father to trust my medical judgment. I failed to find a way to save that boy's life, and I've been carrying that failure with me ever since. Ruth, you can't save people who won't let you help them. Can't I? Maybe if I'd been more persuasive, more insistent, maybe if I'd found a way to make Mr. Brennan understand the urgency. Maybe if you'd been a man, he would have listened to you the first time, Ezra said bluntly. But that's not your failing, that's his. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun sink lower toward the western mountains. Then Ruth spoke again, her voice stronger now. Henderson is going to use Timothy's death to destroy me here, just like the Brennan family destroyed me in San Francisco. He'll tell everyone that I'm a dangerous doctor who kills patients through incompetence. He'll make people afraid to let me treat them. Will you let him? Ruth looked surprised by the question. What do you mean? I mean, are you going to run away again? Are you going to let Henderson drive you out of Silver Creek the same way those other doctors drove you out of California? I don't know if I have a choice. You always have a choice, Ezra said firmly. You can run, or you can stay and fight. You can let Henderson control the story, or you can tell your own story. What if people don't believe me? What if they decide I'm too dangerous to practice medicine? Ezra gestured toward the town, where smoke was rising from chimneys as families prepared their evening meals. Ruth, look around you. These people have seen what you can do. They've watched you risk your life to save others. They've seen your skill, your dedication, your courage. Do you really think they'll abandon you because of something that happened years ago in a different state? People change their minds when they get scared. Some people do, but others stand by their friends when times get tough. Ezra took her hands in his. I'm not going anywhere, Ruth. Whatever Henderson throws at us, we'll face it together. Ruth searched his face, looking for doubt or uncertainty. Even if it means your business suffers? Even if people stop coming to your shop because you're associated with me? My business doesn't matter if I lose the person who's brought meaning back to my life, Ezra replied. I spent 6 months after Martha died just going through the motions of living. You've reminded me what it feels like to be truly alive again. Ezra, I'm not finished. Ruth, I know we haven't known each other long, but I also know that some things are worth fighting for. Your right to practice medicine is worth fighting for. This community's right to have a skilled, caring doctor is worth fighting for. And what's growing between us, that's definitely worth fighting for. Ruth stepped closer to him, her eyes reflecting the golden light of sunset. Are you sure? Because if we do this, if we stay and fight Henderson, it's going to get ugly. He'll attack both of us, try to destroy everything we care about. Let him try, Ezra said. I've seen what you're made of, Ruth Calloway. I've watched you face down angry doctors, hostile officials, and burning buildings. Henderson doesn't scare me, and he shouldn't scare you either. Ruth smiled for the first time since Henderson's threat. You know what? You're right. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of letting other people's prejudices determine where I can live and work and be happy. So what do? We prepare for war, Ruth said, her voice growing stronger with determination. Henderson wants to destroy me with the story of Timothy Brennan? Fine. But I'll make sure people hear the whole story, not just his twisted version of it. How? Ruth's smile grew wider. By doing what I do best, helping people. Henderson can spread all the rumors he wants, but actions speak louder than words. When people see me saving lives, healing injuries, and caring for their families, they'll judge me by what I do, not by what he says. And if that's not enough, then we'll face whatever comes next. Together. Ruth reached up and touched Ezra's cheek. Thank you for believing in me, even when I was ready to stop believing in myself. Thank you for reminding me that some things are worth believing in, Ezra replied. As they walked back toward town, hand in hand, Ruth felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the courage to stop running and start building a life worth defending. She'd spent so long protecting herself from pain that she'd forgotten the joy of fighting for something precious. Tomorrow, Henderson would likely begin his campaign to destroy her reputation and drive her from Silver Creek. There would be lies to counter, fears to overcome, and battles to fight. But tonight, for the first time since Timothy Brennan's death, Ruth felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She wasn't just a traveling doctor anymore, moving from place to place to avoid her past. She was a woman with a home to defend, a community to serve, and a man who loved her enough to stand by her side no matter what storms might come. In Ezra's blacksmith shop, the forge burned low but steady, its coals glowing like hope in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow they would face Henderson's worst attacks, but they would face them together. And sometimes, Ruth realized, that's all the strength you need. Someone who believes in you enough to share whatever battles lie ahead. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and possibility as Silver Creek settled into evening, unaware that its newest residents had just decided to make their stand against forces that would drive them apart. In the morning, the real fight would begin. But tonight, love had won its first victory.